I'm sure you've heard that women were terribly oppressed in ancient history, that they lived in a society run by men and for men, that they held no real power, that they were spectators of their own lives. Ironically, this view is held by two opposite sides of the spectrum, two sides of the same coin, you might say. But we're going to take that coin and toss it into the well of knowledge, to look at the real role of ancient European women, a role that was far less crystallized than Victorian England. We're going to tell the truth about ancient European women. Hi friends, I'm Kevin McLean. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and consider supporting me on Patreon, PayPal, or now directly through YouTube. Your support helps me to continue making videos like this. Much thanks to all of my supporters. Now, in speaking of ancient European women, we're obviously dealing with generalities. They all had individual societies that had their particular differences, but they also had things in common. And often those things in common trace back to an Indo-European origin. The interesting thing is their differences might tell us something about the people who came before them. A famous Lithuanian feminist archaeologist, Maria Gimbutas, is perhaps best known for her Kurgan theory, which proposed that the origin of the Indo-Europeans was the steppelands of Ukraine and Russia, one which many believe today to be at least partially correct. However, another theory that she held was that the Neolithic farmers who dwelt in Europe previously were a peaceful and potentially matriarchal society that was then brutally crushed by the patriarchal society of the Indo-Europeans. Detailed studies have been conducted on the remains of many Neolithic Europeans for decades, and a cataloging of the results show that Neolithic peoples were far more likely to die as a result of violence than the later Indo-Europeans. Some remains show genetic proof for incest, and there is some evidence that points to men having multiple wives. Gimbutas based her theory in part on female fertility figurines and Minoan art to try to show the central focus of women in the culture. But artistic and often sexual representations of women do not necessarily correspond to a society where women hold significant social power. Greece seems to have been the most influenced by the culture of these Neolithic farmers, but they were also the most restrictive of Europeans towards women and their social roles and legal rights. This suggests the opposite of what Gimbutas postulated. Rather than being a society of female empowerment, the Neolithic farmers of Europe were in fact more restrictive of women than the Indo-Europeans. These differences in the treatment of women can be seen as the greater influence of the Neolithic population on the south of Europe as opposed to the north. Early Chalcolithic and Bronze Age Indo-European cultures show them to lean towards individualistic expressions of power, focusing on the burial of great tribal leaders who were typically buried alone within a graveyard used by their descendants. While the majority of these burials were men, around 20% of excavated elite burials were women. While men were typically buried facing east, women were typically buried facing west, a point which could have cosmological significance within the early Indo-European worldview. They were also typically given different types of grave goods. Men were buried with axes, arrows, and pots, and women were buried with decorative ware and pots, although occasionally women were likewise buried with weapons or tools as well. Now, such burials make no sense in a society that supposedly hates women. These women received the highest honors, above that which the vast majority of men could ever hope for. They make sense, however, when one realizes that though their ancient cultures and beliefs were different to our own, people are people. Men love women and did love them as mothers, daughters, wives, and in cases of exceptional women, they were likewise given great honors by both men and women as leaders of society. Greek accounts of the Celts tell us that upon the death of her husband, the wife of the king would gain his possessions and even his rule. This is perhaps borne out in the historical examples of Boudica, who appears to have become the ruler of the Iceni after the death of her husband. Gaelic legendary history also tells of a certain Macha, who became ruler after the death of her father. Her father's two co-rulers judged that a woman should not hold political power, but she defeated them in battle and took the rule upon herself. In Ulster tales, Ailill and Medivh ruled Connacht, but it's clear that Medivh is in fact the true ruler. Yet these tales were once believed to be historical accounts, not fables, and they show a belief that at least some women could and did hold immense political power and prestige, surpassing that of most men, even in what is described as a patriarchal society. The idea that a woman could hold political power is linked to another Indo-European concept, that the sovereignty of a kingdom ultimately rests with the woman. In the most ancient times, the king was seen as a representative or embodiment of the god of heaven. His wife was the embodiment of the goddess of the earth, and it was she who held the power of sovereignty, which could only be obtained by the king through his marriage to her. But this was not and could not be the oppression of the woman, just as the land, if held through violence and fear, would be ruined through constant strife. So the wife also must be a willing partner. In Gaelic legend, a certain King Ailill forces himself upon the goddess of the land, raping her. She bites off his ear in the process, and sees to it that he comes to an untimely end. While it was most typical for a man to exercise rule, his power could only be properly manifested by a harmonious balance between masculine and feminine, sky and earth. Without this, the land and people would come to ruin. Each had their own roles, but the ideal was a balanced union, representative of the natural order, not of violent subjugation. Even among the very masculine-oriented Norse, it was considered bad luck for a daughter to be forced to marry a man she did not freely accept to take. If she was forced, ruin would often be the result. During the Christian era, patriarchal laws were established in some states which gave rights to the father or mother to arrange a marriage without the daughter's consent, and to force such a union. But that there were such laws drafted on such topics likely meant that there were disputes about this practice. In the Gothic laws we read the following: "For though men have received their name from the fact that they control women by their superior strength, some, in violation of the laws of nature, give the priority to women, when they unite females of an advanced age with boys who are little more than children, and thus, for the sake of gain, and through unwise delay, encourage the commission of vice by the former." A law was created to prevent younger men from marrying older women, meaning that previously such practices were common enough to cause them to want to ban it. It again reinforces the idea that the severe practices of patriarchy most thought about and resented today were specifically part of a Christian practice. The reason is partly due to the culture from which Christianity emerged. Aristotelian thought within the church also played a large role in this view of the supposed inferiority of women, and seems to be directly summed up by the writer of this law when he gives a physical, functional explanation for why men rule women. Burials and DNA testing has shown that the early Indo-European family structure was based around the monogamous family unit, likely not much different from that which continues to the present day. Not all cultures in the world practice this, but the vast majority do, which probably suggests that human biology favors this social arrangement. Monogamy in the prehistoric world reduced competition between men, which could lead to violence, and provided women with a higher level of security and power within the family. Rather than being one of potentially many wives ruled over like cattle by a single powerful master, she was at least, ideally, a partner and co-ruler of the family, even if the man was given final decision-making authority. The monogamous family emerged from tens of thousands of years of social experience. The cultural form was so powerful that even the pre-Christian king could have only one wife. Though undoubtedly he indulged in plenty of affairs, these women could never equal his wife, who was not a token possession, but had real power and the respect of the community, in some cases, able to rule on her own. Even Zeus, the king of the gods, was forced to sneak around in order to sleep with the mortals and goddesses that he fancied, fearful of his wife's anger. The two openly quarrel, once with Zeus resorting to threats in order to end the bickering. But Hera is by no means subdued or submissive at any point. When open arguing does not work, she uses cunning against him to bring about the victory of the Greeks over the Trojans, whom Zeus favored. Hera once went so far as to organize a plot to overthrow her husband, from which he only escaped through the intervention of Thetis, the sea nymph mother of Achilles. The king of the gods was overthrown through the machinations of a woman, but also restored to the throne through the aid of a woman, emphasizing that even among the early Greeks, who had perhaps the strictest form of patriarchy among the Indo-European cultures, that the woman's role in bestowing the power of sovereignty can still be found in myths. Likely it's also at the heart of the meaning of Helen and her flight to Troy with Paris. The overall relationship dynamic between Hera and Zeus is almost certainly the poet drawing on the flesh and blood dynamic between a king and his queen in his own day, which hardly suggests that women were only a submissive bystander of history. Analysis of many of the early elite Indo-European women show that they were not native to the area that they were buried, but had moved long distances in their lifetimes. Sometimes the female burials show signs of different cultural influences. This is evidence for the practice of exogamy, marrying from outside one's own tribe or even ethnic group at times. In order to make tribal alliances, the daughters of one tribe would marry the sons of another tribe, thus solidifying their bond in blood. To turn against one another after such a union would then be to turn against one's own kin. This idea is represented in European myths and was practiced by European nobility into the modern era. Yet that such marriages were established to build alliances proves the love and respect which men had for their daughters and wives. If they didn't care about these women, then why would their marriage be expected to hold any binding significance? In the tale of Romulus and Remus, the twins make off with the daughters of the Sabines. However, when their fathers and brothers come to rescue them, they throw themselves in the midst of battle, insisting that the men not fight one another, for they have grown to love the Romans and even have children with them, nor can they bear to see their husbands strike down their fathers or brothers. The men all stop fighting, bowing to the good sense of the women. Though the tale involves the forceful abduction of these women, in the end the men view the women with respect and love, not simply as objects. Many Greek tales and some Roman ones involve the abduction of women. This does seem to have been part of an ancient practice, and we cannot overlook the warlike and brutal realities of society. However, the early law seems to have been very strict in the punishment of abduction and rape of women. The Visigothic law code prescribes that if a man should carry off a woman by force, but the woman is rescued, he must give up half his property to her. If he succeeds in raping her, then he must give her all his property and become her slave for the rest of his life. If only we had such justice today. The act of marriage conveyed upon the woman certain rights in her relationship. In many European pre-Christian societies, the woman possessed a legal right to divorce on the grounds of mistreatment by her husband. There was no "till death do us part," and this was the original purpose of dowries. The father of the woman would give money or land to the daughter upon marriage, though depending on the culture, the property may have ended up legally managed by her husband. It was, though, the daughter's portion of the father's property, and in a number of European societies she inherited property on an equal basis with her brothers. Though in some cases this property was managed by the husband, it was not properly speaking his. Likewise, the husband would often also have to contribute money to the wife or to her family. This wealth was also a form of security for the woman, and often she was able to deal with it how she wanted, or sometimes it was managed by the father on her behalf. If a husband mistreated his wife, she could leave him, in which case any property or wealth she brought into the marriage through the dowry was returned to her. Any money the man gave to the woman was not returned. This system originally created a powerful monetary incentive for the man to treat his wife properly, or risk serious financial consequences. This doesn't show a society that was organized around benefiting men at the expense of women, but one which had devised a clever incentive scheme to try and ensure that their daughters were respected and treated well by their husbands. But by the High Middle Ages, the Christian-based laws had come to replace pre-Christian traditional law around marriage and divorce, and it completely undermined this system. Though the custom of giving the dowry continued, the ability for women to actually divorce was eliminated, making it nearly impossible for her to exercise influence over her husband in this way. This led to an increasingly oppressive situation within marriage, as the woman had very limited options in the event of a bad marriage, and men were empowered over women to an unhealthy degree. Women had the power to bind nations together through marriage, but conversely, they could set them at war. The woman who causes war is a frequent trope, not to be dismissed as an example of misogyny, but as an expression of the great influence that women had over political decisions, and possibly a religious role of women in ancient Indo-European society. An historical account of the Celts recorded by Plutarch is contained in his Moralia titled On the Bravery of Women. Before the Celts crossed over the Alps and settled in that part of Italy, which is now their home, dire and persistent factional discord broke out among them, which went on and on to the point of civil war. The women, however, put themselves between the armed forces, and taking up the controversies, arbitrated and decided them with such irreproachable fairness that a wonderful friendship of all towards all was brought about between both states and families. As the result of this, they continued to consult the women in regard to war and peace, and to decide through them any disputed matters in their relations with their allies. Many goddesses are linked to aspects of war in European myths: Roman Bellona, Greek Athena, Macha, Badov, and the Morgul in Gaelic myth, Germanic Frigg. There is also reoccurring myths about warrior women and women who train young men in martial arts. Now, it's sometimes argued that this is only ancient fantasy, that these are goddesses and not real women. However, the Indo-European deities are largely based around the ancient social order, which is then bound up with forces in the natural world. There is a smith god because there is a smith. There is a healer god because there is a healer. There is a warrior god because there are warriors. And there is a king of the gods because there is a king of men. This is fundamentally what the pantheon is, a reflection of the ancient society, often crystallized at a particular point in the culture's prehistory. With this in mind, the reoccurring themes across Indo-European legends about warrior women and goddesses is because at some point, this was a real feature of Indo-European culture. Among the Greeks, there is Athena, closely linked to both wisdom and warfare, as well as creative arts. Artemis, the huntress. Enyo, a warrior goddess who is daughter or sister of Ares. And the heroine Atalanta, who plays a key role in the Caledonian boar hunting tale. Of course, the Greeks also tell many tales about the Amazons, a tribe of warrior women who practiced very unique customs. While much of their legends are likely fanciful, the region that they were said to have resided was the location of the Indo-European Scythians, and may be at least partly inspired by some real ancient custom among a particular Scythian group. While warrior women were not thought to be numerous, the ancient sources are united in the belief that they existed, and not only in legendary times. Ordinary women, in times of extreme need, were sometimes said to have risen up and taken arms. A tale of the women of Argos says, "But when Cleomenes, king of the Spartans, having slain many Argives, proceeded against the city, an impulsive, daring, divine inspiration came to the young women to try, for their country's sake, to hold off the enemy. Under the lead of Telesia, they took up arms, and taking their stand by the battlements, manned the walls all round, so that the enemy were amazed. The result was that Cleomenes they repulsed with great loss, and the other king, Demaratus, who managed to get inside and gain possession of the Pamphyliacum, they drove out. In this way, the city was saved. The women who fell in the battle were buried close to the Argive road, and to the survivors they granted the privilege of erecting a statue of Ares as a memorial of their surpassing valor." This tale is not, in fact, isolated, but only one of many similar stories of women having engaged in acts of extreme bravery and physical combat in an hour of great need. Greeks and Romans record contemporary accounts of Germanic and Celtic women having fought alongside men, and it appears to have been common for the wife of a Celtic warrior to accompany him to battle, though typically helping with baggage and provisions, which, after all, was a massive undertaking and an absolute necessity for sustaining any army. Norse legend and saga speak frequently about shield maidens, but also about Valkyries, who likely had a very ancient Indo-European origin and were concerned with inspiring men to war and governing their fate in battle, thought to be servants of the war god. In Gaelic myth, Badhav, Macha, and Morrigu are called the three Furies, or war goddesses, and in myth they inspire battle and shape the fates of the warriors. The idea of these types of goddesses are interwoven with what was an ancient religious practice where selected women believed to have magical powers would walk among the men as they prepared for battle, chanting, inciting them to victory, and inspiring battle frenzy. Roman historian Tacitus says of the Britons, "On the shores stood the opposing army with its dense array of armed warriors, while between the ranks dashed women in black attire like the Furies, with hair disheveled, waving brands." It's likely that all Indo-European peoples originally had a certain class of women who performed similar rituals before and during battle, and that this is an explanation for why so many goddesses in Indo-European tradition are linked to war. Some of these women may also have engaged in ritualized training of young men, akin to Athena, Minerva, or Gaelic Scathach. While women were not generally as physically powerful as men, weapons reduce the advantages of sheer physical strength, and a woman with a weapon skilled in combat is not at a significant disadvantage against a man. Women are generally less inclined to pursue martial activity because their biology orients them to different pursuits, as with all gender dimorphic species. However, there were always and are always exceptions, and these women were seemingly given specific social roles in ancient societies that wove seamlessly between myth and reality. In some cases, the social practices died away, only to be left in myth and legends. But in Northern Europe, these fighting females persisted into the historical period, only to be done away with by Christianity. However, these women were not defying gender roles or rebelling against the social order, because this was part of the social order, a less common but long-standing tradition which certain women participated in based on their own natural inclinations. Of course, the vast majority of women and men were not warriors. So what did the vast majority of women do? Some imagine a life of slavery, imprisoned in the home under the threat of a totalitarian husband. The reality of ancient patriarchy is far more complicated. Men had their social expectations, and women had theirs. Men were required to undertake matters of state, to sacrifice their lives in war. Women were not under these same obligations, but they were far from passive spectators. They most certainly played an active role in politics, even if not often directly. They gave their counsel and also exerted pressure on men to make decisions that they wanted made. Saxo Grammaticus says, Hadding's daughter, Ulfhild, who was wife to a certain private person called Guthorm, was moved either by anger at her match or with aspirations to glory, and throwing aside all heed of daughterly love, tempted her husband to slay her father, declaring that she preferred the name of queen to that of princess. There are plenty of other tales of women who aid their husbands in their rule or avenge their murders. Plutarch recalls a tale of a Celtic queen named Cama, whose husband was murdered by a man who sought to woo her. She poisons her husband's murderer and herself in the process, but dies satisfied that she had been able to avenge her husband's death. However, where common women exerted the most power, and where their primary social expectations were centered, was in domestic life. Now, I can already see your eyes rolling, but come on, give me a minute here. Domestic life in the ancient world was massive, far, far greater than it is today. For it was in the home that the majority of the economic activity of the ancient world was undertaken, and women were at the very center of this. While people today have an idea of home life as just looking after kids and cooking dinner, this is not a correct reflection of ancient domestic responsibilities. Childcare was only a small part of that, and beyond feeding in the early years, this task was often the responsibility not of the mother, but of the grandmother or other relatives or neighbors who were too old for more strenuous duties. Of course, there was cooking, cleaning, and food preparation, but some of these tasks were performed by men also, especially preparation of meat. What women across not only Europe, but practically the entire world excelled in and made practically their exclusive domain was textile manufacturing. Now, when put this technical way, perhaps people will give weaving the respect that it deserves. Women, and almost only women until the late medieval period, were responsible for the creation of nearly all textiles. Every European mythology and folklore links women with the act of weaving, and from this social practice comes the goddesses of fate, who, like women, weave the strands which govern people's lives. Penelope, the wife of Odysseus, in one of our oldest European tales, delays her suitors by weaving and unweaving a funeral tapestry for many years. And it's possible to read into this the idea that Odysseus' life is actually connected to this tapestry. The creation of textiles was a massive part of the ancient economy and was, until perhaps the medieval period, practically the exclusive domain of women. From the gathering of the plant fibers, to spinning of the thread, to the weaving on the loom. Roman wall paintings from Pompeii show women engaging in every aspect of commercial clothing manufacturing. These textiles were exported by Rome across the Mediterranean, and they were mostly made by women. Yet in smaller, more local economies, like existed in Northern Europe, such textile production would have played an even larger role in the much smaller and more local economy. Without her work, her family would have had nothing but the most crude of animal hides to wear. Her craft represents one of the first great arts of humanity. There is likely a natural reason why women came to almost monopolize the creation of textiles. Their hands tend to be more deft. It is perhaps less physically demanding than something like housing construction, but it is very labor-intensive and demands a keen mind and years of training to do well. Girls would train in this art form from a very young age. This process of industrialization dramatically changed the dynamic of the household life. The reality is that women did not just join the workforce in modern times. Women had always been in the workforce, but a great deal of that work used to be done in the home, whereas the Industrial Revolution moved that work outside the home. But women did more than make clothing. Girls and young women in many European traditions tended cattle and flocks. This is preserved in many folk tales, and often it's a goddess who is connected most with cattle. Among the Celts, the women also helped tend the fields, something that Romans found shocking, commenting that Celtic women did nearly all the tasks of labor. The Gaelic myth of Taltu, goddess of the land, says she died of exhaustion after clearing the field named after her. This gives an example of the type of work that ancient Irish women engaged in. Women were also engaged in arts of healing and studied the mystery of herb lore. Anciently, this art is inseparable from magic, and during the Middle Ages, zealous Christians linked it to witchcraft. They served as priestesses, with the cults of most goddesses requiring priestesses to lead their worship rather than priests. In ancient Greece, Sappho was a greatly celebrated and highly regarded poetess, but there was also Corinnia, Moiro, Anite, among many others. There were female artists such as Cora and Anaxandra, who painted pre-Christian religious icons, as did Irina and Temerita. There were also some female potters. All these women were daughters of craftsmen or artists who had taught their daughters, and they had excelled in it. Their work was highly regarded for centuries, such that we still know some of their names today. But certainly there were thousands of other craftswomen and artists who, like most men as well, simply go unmentioned in history. Now, of course, women also helped to raise and teach children, and nobody should look down upon this noble and necessary task. They also cooked, baked, tended the home fire, washed clothes in the river, drew water, hauled it to the home, and numerous other tasks which had to all be done by hand in those days and was actually physically demanding. There were gender roles for the allocation of many tasks, but they were not the same in every society. And even within a single cultural group like the Greeks, there were local differences, such as between Athens, which had very restrictive roles for women, and Sparta, where women were given larger public place and more responsibilities, and even female competitive sports. There were a variety of views about women held by ancient people. Likely the majority just looked at the gender divide in the same way as they looked at the gender divide between various animals that they knew and dealt with on a daily basis. There were various stereotypes of women, of course. Both Greeks and Gaels agreed that they couldn't be trusted with secrets, for instance. Hesiod, one of the earliest Greek writers, believed that women were created by Zeus as a punishment related to Prometheus's theft of fire, and feels that only a very few men are able to find a good wife, but that the single man is even worse off. However, best known for the box of woes that she opened, Pandora's name actually means all gifts, suggesting a very different understanding of the first woman. Hermes was said to have named her, for all the gods of heaven bestowed a gift upon her. Athena gave her skill in needlework and weaving. Aphrodite made her desirable. Hephaestus made her form. The Charities adorned her with their blessings, as did the seasons. Hermes himself bestowed upon her mind and speech. Of course, Hesiod puts a negative spin on this, but it is doubtful in origin that it was negative. Rather, originally it meant that women, like Hermes, are quick-thinking, skilled speakers, and great helpers and guides to men, and maybe only a tad sly from time to time. We can see this ancient focus on women in the oldest tales of Homer. The Iliad is about trying to recover a woman, and the Odyssey is about trying to get back to a woman. In fact, the Odyssey is intensely focused on female power, and many of the major characters are women. Odysseus is captured by two goddesses in this story. Penelope stalls the suitors, waiting almost without hope for the return of her husband, but using her wit in order to hold everything in stasis. Odysseus, seduced by the goddess Circe, still chooses to surrender immortality in return to be home with his wife.
But if you could only know how much suffering is in store for you before you get back to your own country, you would stay where you are, keep house along with me, and let me make you immortal, no matter how anxious you may be to see this wife of yours, of whom you are thinking all the time, day after day. Yet I flatter myself that I am in no whit less tall or well-looking than she is, for it is not to be expected that a mortal woman should compare in beauty with an immortal.
Goddess, do not be angry with me about this. I'm quite aware that my wife Penelope is nothing like so tall or as beautiful as yourself. She's only a woman, whereas you are an immortal. Nevertheless, I want to get home. I can think of nothing else. If some god wrecks me when I'm at sea, I will bear it and make the best of it. I have had infinite trouble both by land and sea already, so let this go with the rest. The ancient ideas about women, as with many other topics, are expressed through the divergent views of Plato and Aristotle. While Aristotle believed that women were possessing some of the intellectual qualities of men, possessed them to a lesser degree, and were by their nature inherently inferior to men, and must be controlled by men. Plato thought otherwise. Plato believed that though the bodies of men and women are different, the souls of men and women are the same, and that if a woman were given the same education and upbringing as men, then they could also develop excellence in all the arts, and be as skilled and knowledgeable as men. He shared this view with the earlier Pythagoreans, who influenced his thinking. Of course, as with most subjects, Plato was right. Of course, men held greater social power in the past than women, and there were social constraints on what women could do, and strong ideas about what they should do, and what they should take pride in. But women were not passive spectators of history. Likewise, though men had more social power, there were equally strong ideas about what men should do, and powerful social forces which compelled them to do it. Some of these expectations still exist, especially regarding war. As this video is made, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians and Russian men have died in battle, compelled to fight by their governments. Yet women are not dragged off the streets and forced to the front. They are exempt from this. A few have enlisted in the military, desiring to fight for their respective nations, but the overwhelming majority are men, and only men are forced to do it, and it will be men who overwhelmingly pay the ultimate price. This has always been the case throughout history, and it should be kept in mind when considering the power disbalance that existed between men and women in ancient society. Well, I hope you found this video interesting, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and as always, stand tall.